So I want to begin our quick exploration of Jewish sources with an unconventional place to start this year, which is in the Mishnah Brura. We love the Mishnah Brura in this Chabura, and we even learned earlier in the year the laws of tzitzis. In the laws of tzitzis, Shulchan Aruch writes in 23:1, Mutar likanes bebeit hakvaros v'lavosh tzitzis. You are allowed to go into a cemetery wearing tzitzis, but you cannot let your tzitzis drag on the kvarim. But if the tzitzis are dragging on the kvarim, on the graves, so then it's mocking the poor. So you shouldn't do that. What does it mean? It's mocking the poor. It means the dead people are no longer with us. They can't fulfill mitzvahs. And so it's like making fun of them that I can fulfill tzitzis and you, dead people, can't. And it's apparently insulting and hurtful to them. Okay? Now, says the Mishnah Brura, Sif Katan Hey, Vafilu Bekever Shel Katan Yesh Lahachimir Mishum Loeg Larash. And even of a youngin, let's say less than 13-year-old boy, you shouldn't wave your tzitzis at his grave. The Shema Nishmas Adam Gadol, who is, it could be in his previous life he had the soul of a regular person, of a man. And since he came back as a child, but as a child he was not chayiv in tzitzis, but in his previous life he may have been chayiv in tzitzis, therefore we shouldn't wave our tzitzis and drag our tzitzis on his grave.
So is that a practice done that guys that normally have their tzitzis out must tuck them in at the cemetery?
Right, so that's the reason why people who wear long tzitzis should tuck in the tzitzis by the kever. Now, why is this relevant to all of us? Because implied in this offhand, random quote, so to speak, of the Mishnah Brura is a belief in the concept of Gilgul Neshamot, of soul reincarnation. He's saying that this boy, in a previous lifetime, his soul may have been a male, and therefore a man, and therefore we have to be concerned. Okay, so in his halachic treatise, the Mishnah Brura, amazingly enough, is bringing in halacha lamaisa, the concept of reincarnation, that he believes in reincarnation, and in even affect halacha lamaisa. Everybody got that? For those who are familiar with the Chafetz Chaim, it's not so surprising. He actually would often bring in Kabbalistic concepts into his works. And in the Chafetz Chaim, in his Sefer, he actually talked about the concept of maybe if you sin, the sin of Lashon Hara, you might have to come back as an animal to fix that sin, perhaps as a dog, etc., etc. It's not really so surprising, but it's kind of interesting that in the Mishnah Brura itself, he mentions the concept of reincarnation. Yes, question, Daniel. Let's already jump into the fact that there are rabbis who didn't necessarily subscribe to the concept of Gilgul Nishamot. Okay? Because oftentimes people say, yeah, but not everybody believes in that. And that's true. Not every rabbi throughout all of Jewish history did agree that there's a concept of Gilgul Nishamot. One argument often made is that it's not explicitly mentioned in the Chumash or in the Gemara. Okay? And since it's not mentioned in the Chumash and Gemara, many ask, it certainly can't be a fundamental of our belief. And why doesn't, if it's so important, why wouldn't the Gemara at least explicitly mention that? Which is a very good point. Who are some rabbis who don't believe in it? like I said, the Rabbeinu Sadia Hagaon writes about it, and in his beliefs, Emunas V'Deos. Apparently, there were those in his time who did believe in Gilgul Neshamos, in other religions, I believe, and who talked about animals and souls and men coming back as different animals and giving various proofs of that. And he didn't think that those proofs were convincing, and he didn't think that it was true. So he lived in the 9th and 10th century in Egypt, and he didn't believe in it. The Rashba also has a street name here in Rechavia, so he's chashiv and is a great posek. Didn't believe in it. He was a Talmudist and a halachist. Rav Chastai Kreskis, who wrote Or Hashem, a Jewish philosopher, argues. He said, why don't people remember their previous reincarnations? What's the point of it if we don't remember what we've done? What would be the point of it? Rav Yitzchak Albo, another famous Jewish philosopher, lived in the 15th century in Spain. In Sefer Ikarim, says, what would be the point of that? Rabbeinu Avraham ben Harambam, who was a great rabbi, the son of the Rambam, writes against reincarnation. His dad did not write against reincarnation, but he also didn't write for it. So he didn't talk about it. But his son, the Rav Avraham ben Harambam, writes against reincarnation. And Leon de Madonna says that why couldn't God handle it in one lifetime? Why does he need to make people come back to another lifetime? And finally, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, in his commentary in Bereshis, chapter 50, verse 2, writes that the Egyptians believed in Gilgul Neshamas, but a Jew does not necessarily believe in the concept in reincarnation. And he believed that every soul is unique and fresh and brand new. And so, again, just for the sake of honesty, there were great, generally rationalist rabbis, generally not necessarily in the Kabbalistic school of thought, who did not subscribe to the belief of reincarnation, unlike all of the many, many rabbis who we're going to mention next, who did believe in the concept of reincarnation. Okay? Questions, thoughts, comments. Is living recently in the 19th century. So all the rabbis I mentioned are way before the Mishnah Berurah. So you're saying, how does the Mishnah Berurah account for them? They don't have to account for the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is coming after them. Okay? In terms of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who actually comes after the Mishnah Berurah, perhaps Rav Hirsch would say, okay, that's the opinion of the Mishnah Berurah. I don't necessarily subscribe to every single thing that the Mishnah Berurah ever said. I'm not necessarily bound. He's not the only posek. There's the Aruch HaShulchan, there's the Chai Adam, there's other opinions in the halacha, not only the Mishnah Berurah. So perhaps a modern day rationalist, halachist would say something like that. By the way, Rav Hirsch was living in Germany, a very, very rationalist, not necessarily Kabbalistic at all type of culture. So it's not so shocking that he's not necessarily going to subscribe to every Kabbalistic interpretation. Okay? Quickly go through a few names of big rabbis who subscribed and talked about reincarnation. But again, I'm only mentioning a few of the big hitters. There's many more. So, first off, it's mentioned most famously by the Ramban, the famous 13th century commentary on Chumash, the holy Nachmanides, and he writes in the context of Yibum. He says, what does it mean, V'lo yimachesh shmo miYisrael, that the name of the child will not be erased? It means because when you do Yibum, the Levirate marriage, there's a great sod. Now, the Ramban was afraid to reveal the secret, so he doesn't explicitly say, but he seems pretty clearly to be alluding to the fact that the soul of the deceased is going into the body of the new child, and that's why the deceased is living on through the new child. L'chora, that seems to be how the commentators on the Ramban, Chavel and all the rest, understand the Ramban. The Ramban was a student of great Kabbalists, like Rabbeinu Bachaya, if I'm not mistaken, who also talks about Gilgul Neshamot, and all the Kabbalists really believe in Gilgul Neshamot, so it makes sense that that's what the Ramban is referring to. There is a famous verse in Eov that we mentioned before, Eov 33, verse 29. Truly, God does all these things 2 or 3 times to a man, to bring him back from the pit, that he may bask in the light of life. So many of the Kabbalistic commentators explain that we come back from the pit and from death to come back to the world 2 or 3 times. And that's alluded to in Eov. They find other sources in various verses throughout Tanakh, which are allusions to the concept of reincarnation. Sefer HaBahir, which is attributed to Tana, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakaneh, in the 2nd century, is the first explicit mention that we know about talking about the reincarnation of souls. This is talking about a rabbi from Talmudic times. It's not mentioned in the Gemara, but it's quoted by Kabbalistic sources by Rabbi Nechunya, who was from Talmudic times. And Rabbi Nechunya uses reincarnation to help us understand the question of tzaddik v'ralo. Why bad things happen to good people. Rabbi Nechunya says the best way to understand why it could be that, I don't know, a little child gets sick, he didn't do anything wrong, how could it be? So he says the only way to understand it is through the concept of reincarnation. In his previous life, this child must have had some debt to be repaid, and chula v'chula. And that he's one of the earliest sources which talk about Gilgul and the concept of explaining Emunah issues.
The Baal Shem Tov also.
People don't realize Onkelos himself, Targum Onkelos, which the Gemara in Megillah says was given at Sinai. Okay, Onkelos says, "Yichi Reuven va'al yamut," let Reuven live and not die, means let Reuven live and let him not die a second death. Meaning, don't let Reuven not have to do reincarnation. He doesn't have to come back. So we see, it seems that Onkelos himself is alluding to the concept of Moshe giving Reuven a bracha, that he shouldn't have to go back and do reincarnation. Pretty.
It also seems
Rabbeinu Bachaya, or maybe it's Rabbeinu Bachya, in the 14th century, a Spanish philosopher, actually talks about the 10 martyrs in the Roman persecution of the Jews to be a Gilgul for the 10 brothers of Yosef. So clearly he understands that there's a concept of reincarnation, that those 10 souls came back into the world to achieve their tikkun in the neshamas of all those tzaddikim who were martyred by the Romans. Okay? So that's the 14th century. The Vilna Gaon, of course, in 1720, in his Even Shlema, says all of the book of Yonah is a big mashal for the soul, and subscribes also to the concept of Gilgul Neshamot, which his students, Chaim Volozhin, and the Mishnah Brura, who was a Lithuanian student of the Gra, eventually, also, even though you might think, oh, that's the Hasidim, right, Ariel? You might think, oh, the Hasidim, they're the Kabbalists, and the Hasidim, they're the and the Lithuanians at the Gra Shul, they're the rationalists. They don't sing and dance as much. But even those in the Gra school of thought are Kabbalists. The Gra was a Kabbalist. And since the Arizal and many of the Kabbalists talk about and embrace so importantly this concept of Gilgul Neshamas, they also buy into the concept of Gilgul Neshamos. I guess I skipped, which is quite silly, that the Arizal himself wrote that one of my greatest gifts that I came down into the world to do was to reveal the concept of Gilgul Neshamot, of reincarnation. It wasn't just another one of the gifts, but it was maybe the main chiddush of the Arizal is to reveal this concept of Gilgul Neshamos, And there are many stories of how people would actually go over to them and they would tell them their previous lives, their tikkun that they need to achieve. You look at their foreheads and just know. And so the Arizal embraces this, and his student, Rav Chaim Vital, wrote the Shar HaGilgulim, which is all about the concept of reincarnation and who reincarnated to who, and it's all about that. And now it's available for free online. Just write Gate of Reincarnations on Google, and you can all have access to these Kabbalistic secrets. But he felt like it had been secret for a long time, but the time has come where Am Yisrael needs to know about the secrets of reincarnation. Sounds good? Yeah, with me? Okay. A few more heavy hitters. The Derech Hashem. Who wrote the Derech Hashem? The Ramchal. Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, also one of the greatest Kabbalists ever. And also his Sfarim have been accepted by the yeshiva world to be kind of mainstream Jewish hashkafa. Even though, of course, they're full of Kabbalistic concepts. He also, of course, wrote the Mesilas Yesharim. And the Ramchal writes, a single soul can be reincarnated a number of times in different bodies. In this manner, it can rectify the damage done in previous reincarnations. It can achieve perfection that was not achieved in previous incarnations. And on and on. So he talks a lot about the concept of reincarnation in his beautiful Sefer Derech Hashem, which is considered a mainstream Jewish philosophy sefer to this day. Although the truth is, the Ramchal was anything but mainstream in his day. He was put in Cherem, etc. He didn't have a beard. He lived in Italy, but now he's considered super duper mainstream.
How did he shave? There were no like razors.
I don't imagine he did it with
Cream.
with scissors. I don't know. And also the Tanya, the holy Alter Rebbe. Actually, I skipped because you can't get to the Alter Rebbe until you get to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov embraced wholeheartedly the concept of Gilgul Neshamas. He also was known, he wouldn't tell people their specific tikkun because he didn't think it was helpful, but he was said to have known people's previous reincarnations. He was on a high enough spiritual level, and he would guide people and help them knowing their reincarnations, how they can achieve their tikkun in life. And a few generations later, the Alter Rebbe, the father of Chabad, also writes that many of us have to come back into the world, and so that we can fulfill our 613 mitzvahs. Could be in my previous life, I only did 611. I got to get those last two through, so I might have to come back. Could be I did a mitzvah, but I didn't do it with all my heart and soul. I didn't do it b'machshava dibur v'maiseh. So I might have to come back to the world just to do the mitzvah in its most proper way.
No, that's
Surely we could do all 613 mitzvahs by learning about the 613 mitzvahs, because even though we may not actually, you don't have to get a divorce just to fulfill the mitzvah of getting a divorce, but maybe you could learn about Gittin, and then you don't have to be a melech, but you could learn about melech, you know what I'm saying? Learning about it with the intention to do it is known as actually fulfilling the mitzvah. So that's another promo for learning all of Shas. And Sefer Achinuch, which goes through the 613 mitzvahs, is a great sefer, so you don't have to come back to the world again to learn. The Chida, one of my favorite rabbis ever, also actually wrote about a personal experience with the reincarnation, about a little baby that screamed Shema Yisrael and then died, and then he was convinced. He writes in Shem Gdolim about he himself personally witnessed this story, one of the first case studies in the Torah, in the books. The Chida writes about it. The Reishis Chachma, another Kabbalist, writes about reincarnation. Barbanel, the famous Spanish rabbi who almost saved all of the Jews, was a rationalist, but he also embraced the concept of reincarnation. The Al-Sheikh HaKadosh, the great Darshan and Kabbalist of Tzfat. The Maharsha, who is a Talmudic scholar, but also embraced the concept and explains Gemara as to be alluding to reincarnation. The Holy Shlah, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, the author of Echadodi, and pretty much any Hasidic or Kabbalistic rabbi, Netiv Shalom, whatever. Basically, they all embrace the concept of reincarnation. Of course, Rav Kook said that nowadays many of the Kabbalistic concepts have basically been accepted by the entire Jewish people, and thus they have like a psak din. It's true that you can find rabbis in previous generations that didn't believe in them, just like you can find opinions in the Gemara, which were interesting, but they're not accepted by Am Yisrael. And so there is such a thing as psak in Kabbalah, according to Rav Kook, which is interesting in a shiur in itself. And he also believes that this inyan of reincarnation is something which is accepted by the majority of Klal Yisrael. Yes, Menachem, you're not a koifer if you don't believe in reincarnation, but at the same time, this is something that most rabbis have embraced, and thus a believing Jew generally should try to embrace this perspective. And that's what I have to say about rabbis. Okay? And now we're going to transition, after questions, to modern day scientific case studies which reinforce this belief. Ida is explaining a personal story that he himself was a part of, where this little baby screams out, Shema Yisrael, and goes to the next world. And his only way of making sense of it is that this little baby had to come back into the world for some reason to scream Shema Yisrael in his last words, and thus fulfill his tikkun. Now, is an absolute 100% proof scientifically? No, we don't. This one case would not be enough to necessarily convince a skeptic, but it's certainly, if you would have been there, you would start thinking to yourself, hey, maybe there's something to this. Okay?
There's the Baal Shem Tov story with the young couple.
That's exactly why part 2 of this class is bringing modern day studies with people you literally could call up if you wanted to, with names of doctors and scientists who've done the research, who you have to, in my opinion, be crazy if you actually did the research to think that all 30,000 cases that have been documented about reincarnation are all conspiracy theory by the reincarnation camp. I could see 1 or 2 you could say is above a Maisa, but when we have stories and names and people, you could see their faces in these hundreds of YouTube videos where people are recounting these reincarnation stories. To me, it would be irrational to deny these modern day cases of Gilgul Neshamot.
Yeah.
Okay. You're in a court case, and you're the judge, and the first witness comes up and says, let me tell you a story. Daniel went over to that nice little store, and he stole all the money. And you see, and then another person comes and says, I'm telling you, I saw Daniel steal the money. And 25,000 people say, I saw Daniel steal the money.
They're all lying.
Now, would it then be rational to say, it's just stories. I don't believe in stories. You know what I'm saying? It's just stories. I think that would be irrational. I don't think that would be a very good judge. So similarly, what I'm saying is, it's not just a story. When you have a lot of stories which all seem to provide evidence and indicate the truth of a situation, I think if you genuinely are actually interested in the truth, you will actually ask yourself, what am I to make about these stories? And if you're not, you don't want to think about those topics, then you'll change the channel and you won't think about it. At the end of the day, you're right, Daniel. We have to choose whether we want to be open to the truth or not. You know, plenty of people in the world today just simply want to deny facts and live in their own bubble of reality, and that's okay. All we can do is give them a hug and wish them the best. But if people are genuine, my job is to try to open up people to my understanding of the truth, and either people are interested or not.
There's a great
I like what you said.
First of all, there's a doctor named Ian Stevenson, and now he passed away recently, and his student, Dr. Tucker. And they are both professors in the University of Virginia, if I'm not mistaken, or different universities. They have made it their life's work to gather thousands of stories. Okay, we're talking about thousands and thousands of documented stories of generally children who remember their previous lives. And they try to do this in a very scientific manner. They take into account the biases of the parents. they take into account, is there any reason this child might have these strange memories of his previous lives? Is it possible that it was fed to him by their parents, or is it possible that they saw it on a TV show? All of the basic questions that any skeptic should ask, and trying to do it from a very objective perspective. Even many of them were anti-reincarnation camp until they started studying it. And they will do the research of, let's say, a child claims to have been this person. They'll literally go fly to that other family to do the research, to track down the person that they claim to be in their previous life. And amazingly enough, they'll find many, many links between what the child says and the reality, without the family even knowing about this. Okay? And there are often even birthmarks which correspond. In other words, if in their previous life they died chas v'shalom in a bullet hole, oftentimes they'll have birthmarks which correspond to the way in which they died in their previous lives, which are hard to make up. And you have many stories of people who exact details have been corresponded in a way in which there's just, to me, no rational way of explaining how they could have known this, if not for the fact that their claims are actually true. Okay? So, again, this is a real scientific matter. It's not something that just people say. There's many books on this topic. Carol Bauman writes about this. There's people whose profession is studying this topic. It's not just something that we tell stories about. Let me give you a few famous examples. One story which amazed me was about a Druze boy. And this boy was from the north, living in the north of Israel, around the Golan area. Now, many Druze, it's part of the Druze belief system to believe in the concept of reincarnation. They also believe in reincarnation. And this boy claimed to have been in a previous life and had been murdered. So they called up an Israeli doctor, Dr. Eli Lash, who is known, actually he used to help in the Gaza Strip, helping Gazans there, but he also was known to be interested in reincarnation and had studied this matter. So he was a personal witness to this story. And the whole clan goes looking for the previous lifetime of this boy. And he went to different towns in the area between Israel and Syria. And when we get to a particular area, he started feeling like this seems right. This seems like the right place. And they started asking around the locals about, had there been a case of someone who had died in the type of way in which the boy responded. And indeed, there was a person who had disappeared. They thought he just died. They didn't know what the story was. And it was just around the time period that this boy claimed that he had died in the previous lifetime. And then he actually gets close to a particular house. And the boy points out and says, that man was my murderer. That's the guy who killed me. So the whole clan, Dr. Eli recounts, goes and says, is this true? And the boy's pointing at him, you murdered me in your previous life. And the guy admits it. I guess the pressure, he says, yes, I murdered it. The boy takes the clan and they find the skeleton of his previous life with an axe mark in it. And they actually take it to the Druze court, whatever. And the rest of the story is not known. I don't think he was reported to the Israeli police because that's not how the Druze work. But they dealt with him the way that they dealt with him. And this is one of, actually several stories which I read about murder cases which were solved through a thorough investigation after the fact that children remembered their previous life. They went back, they did the research, and it turned out to be true. Okay? Again, there's a book written about this topic. If you're curious, I'll send you the details. There's even a picture here of the skeletons. And
it's creepy, but hard to deny it.
It's in a book called We Have Lived Before by Mr. Hardo. And it aligns with a lot of the other stories that Ian Stevenson talked about. Okay? share another story, a kind of a similar nature. There's a boy in India, and he claimed to have been in a previous life married. He had details about what his previous profession was. He knew where the town he lived was. He knew his wife and his 2 children. He knew all these unbelievable details. And nobody took him too seriously, but his brother, after he kept talking about this, says, I want to go research this. And again, in India, they generally do believe in reincarnation. So they went to the town where it all happened. I think it was Angro. They looked for someone in this profession. They found someone in that radio profession, if I'm not mistaken. They tracked down the family that someone had died in that of the specific accident of like a car accident. He goes up to this little boy, a 5-year-old boy, goes up to his previous lifetime's wife, and he starts calling her name. He says, "Come here." He's a little boy, but he's saying, "Oh, come here, darling." And they didn't know what was going on. And then he starts recounting, remember that picnic we had on the day when I passed away, and I gave you these candies, and very, very specific details, unbelievable details, and the whole family was witness to this. Then they set up his children in the previous life were just playing amongst many, many other people, and he's able to point out, oh, those are my children. He goes specifically and he finds his 2 children. This case was investigated by the authorities in India. It's well documented, and it's again another amazing example of if a skeptic were to say, well, it's just a bunch of Bubba mice, it's people making it up, how could he have known about the candy box? How do you explain that rationally? How could he have known who his 2 children were? Okay? A third story, because we have 5 minutes left. This is an interesting story that you could see in the news. There's a lot of articles and YouTube videos about this one. It was a girl named Barbro. Barbro was a young genius of a author. She would write, I think she still writes children's books. She was an excellent, very talented little girl. When she was a little girl, I think in the 50s or 60s, she heard about Anne Frank. And they just started teaching about Anne Frank. And she was a bit confused because Anne Frank wasn't that famous at the time, but they're thinking, why is the teacher talking about me? I am Anne Frank. She's very confused. Now, the other thing is, this girl had a lot of traumas. She wouldn't take a shower, only bath. Okay? She was afraid of uniforms, people in uniforms, policemen. She wouldn't eat beans. Okay, Anne Frank's family only ate beans during those years. And many other weird traumas. Stars, perhaps. Anyways, later, just a few years later, they built a museum and dedicated it to Anne Frank. So the family takes a trip. Anne Frank had never been in that city before. Not Anne Frank. Barbara had never been in that city before. She gets out of the cab, and she somehow knows how to wind the ways of the streets to get straight to her old house. Her family's in shock. How does this little girl know all this? She gets to the old Anne Frank house, and she says, what did they do with my stairs? They changed the stairs. And indeed, they had just redone the stairs and changed it from the way it originally looked. She went to the corner of the house, and she says, where's my pictures? And indeed, they had just removed all the pictures to fix them up and make them prettier. And but somehow this girl, Barbara, knew about all the details of the house and that the pictures happened to have been placed there. And the story goes on and on, many, many details about how she knows all the details of the house, etc., etc. So this is one of the most well-documented cases of, it seems, Anne Frank, the famous Jewish Holocaust survivor, who comes back.
She didn't survive.
Who comes back, not a survivor, but he comes back as this girl, Barbara. Later, Barbara forgets her memories. Most of these children forget their memories when they get older, as most of us forget our childhood memories. But this is one of those famous documented cases. Another famous story is about a boy named James. James grew up in, I think, Louisiana. And since he's a little boy, he remembers, he has these traumatic dreams about being an airplane bomber in World War II. Right? It's likely you've seen this. There's many YouTube videos. I can send this to you guys if you're interested. And he knows an incredible amount about airplanes without anyone having an explanation as to how he knows all that. He knows all these nitty-gritty details. And his parents, who are very devout Christians, don't know what to do with it, in particular his dad, because Christianity generally does not believe in the concept of reincarnation. So it goes against their belief system. But what are you going to do? It's uncanny how much this kid knows all these crazy details. So the story is very long and the time is short. But basically, James writes pictures and he calls himself James 2. And he remembers the exact place that his plane flew from in Natoma Bay in the Pacific. His father ends up researching, was there a person named James in the previous life? And indeed, there was a person named James in the previous life who flew from a specific area in Natoma Bay and whose plane got crashed. And James, too, James remembered his friends. And the father actually goes back and meets those friends with the same names that he remembers. And there's even a spooky part where James comes to his parents and says, I remember when I chose you. It was in the Pink Hotel in Hawaii. And that happened to have been the night that the father and mother had decided that they wanted to start having children. And that was the night which James claims, and he knew this somehow, and James claims to have chosen his father, which is interesting because it aligns with the Jewish perspective about how the children choose the parents. So anyways, ultimately, the father and mother do end up embracing the concept that it must have been a reincarnated soul. There's no other way for the facts to add up. And little James meets his old family, and they reconnect, and he is able to move on. And I've heard that James is a normal guy, and he plays guitar now, and he was able to move on with his life. And in fact, there's, like I said, a whole slew of people who help these children remember their past lives and move on. Maybe I'll end with one last case study that got me into this whole topic. There's a book called Many Masters, Many Lives, written by a guy named Dr. Brian Weiss. Dr. Brian Weiss was a regular rationalist psychotherapist in the 90s. And a lot of therapists use hypnosis in order to bring people back into their previous childhood memories. Yeah? Now, what happened was when his client, Catherine, started not just remembering her previous memories, she started remembering her previous lives' memories. She started speaking in languages that she didn't even know, like in Egyptian. She started speaking in different voices that no one could explain how she knew these voices in this hypnotic state. And she had all this information about Egyptian culture from 3,000 years ago that she had no way of understanding. And she remembered all of these traumatic deaths from these many, many previous lives. And as soon as she remembered those traumatic deaths, she would start being able to release the pain and move on and be healed from her wounds. And then, just in one of the most eerie parts of the book, of the story, page 54, an angel starts speaking through her to Dr. Brian Weiss and starts recounting the name of Dr. Weiss's father, Avram, and the fact that his child had died from a heart disease, and it was in order to pay back, debts that were owed in a previous life. And Dr. Weiss actually starts, at this point, believing this is true. It's not just her imagination, aside from the fact that she was healed, but how could she have known all this crazy information that she knew nothing about? And so Dr. Weiss goes from a skeptic to actually believing that these memories are real. And to this day, I believe he serves as a past life regressionist, helping people remember their previous lives in a hypnotic state. There's a lot of people. There's a guy in the old city who actually works in that. I was thinking of doing it myself, but it cost too much money for me to afford. But I thought it'd be cool to find out my previous life. Anyways, the point is, sorry that I'm rushing it, but I could go on. I have on my computer 10 more
amazing how much
wacky stories. And if you're curious, again, I'm email you YouTube videos where you could see the people. So, and very, very detailed stories, modern day stories with names on it. There's a new book out just about Holocaust reincarnation stories. If you ask me, there's just too much evidence in the court case in front of us to deny the fact that this is for real. And it's very easy for me to say that because I believe in the concept of reincarnation because that is a big part of the Kabbalistic tradition, which I embrace, and the Jewish tradition for the most part. And so I think these stories are for real. And so next time, we've already touched on a little bit of the why does it matter. But next time, we'll finish up with who cares and why does this matter and why is this relevant to my life. But I think that the fact that there's thousands of these very documented cases really buttresses the Kabbalistic claim and the claim that that we have a soul. Because there are people out there who think we're just a body. And that all this religious stuff is a bunch of hocus pocus made up by rabbis to help people deal with their issues. But I think this scientific evidence offers us permission to really believe in the concept of the soul and that our lives have missions and meaning by something from above. Okay, questions, comments before we wrap up?